this week's episode of Assassination Classroom, Class 3E is getting ready to go on a class field trip to Kyoto, which means we're probably going to get a huge history lesson, and a lot of that Japanese history is going to go right over my head, because I'm going to be paying attention to the weird octopoid teacher who's getting ready to destroy the world. What is really interesting about this week's episode is that not only is the entire class going on a trip, but this is also another one of those episodes that happens to focus on a singular student from the class. This one is focusing on another female by the name of Kanzaki. And Kanzaki is basically the unofficial class mascot of Class 3E. Ironic, we haven't really seen her until this point. She sort of just blends in the background, but she's a very graceful, refined woman who has goals of becoming a star student. But what is she doing in Class 3E? Well, we actually get to learn in this week's episode that she comes from a very prestigious family, and her mother and father are incredibly strict, and they wanted her to do her best. But she sort of rebelled against them, and she sort of became this, like, badass arcade queen, and then suddenly she found herself in Class 3E. And that's when she gets dragged into this week's situation, which is, of course, not going to be a normal school trip to Kyoto, and the first half of the episode is basically just played for laughs and getting to see them make their way to Kyoto, which is really awesome. But my favorite thing about this week's episode is that we actually get to see another school. We get to see this high school, which is filled with delinquents, and we really get to see how Class 3E's assassination training is actually going to help them out in this week's episode. So first up, it's pretty obvious, but the school is still completely giving the shaft to Class 3E. Everybody else is in first class, everybody in 3E is in coach. And of course, everybody still continues to treat them like crap. There's even a little bit of humor with Professor Bitch this week, where she tries to go on the trip looking all super fancy, but Karasuma immediately strips her of that and begins to chaperone her ass. I also really liked the scene where Koro Sensei was hanging on the side of the subway car, and he had to desperately pull himself in, and he was apparently using some sort of camouflage, so if there were people outside, all they would see is a backpack and some clothes, but as Nagisa said, even that's pretty freaking weird. When they finally do arrive to Kyoto, this is when things really start to pick up. Now, a lot of the different people from Class 3E have been divided into groups. We have Karma, Nagisa, Kaede, Kanzaki, Sugino, and Okuda. Now, this is basically the group of characters who has been formally introduced, so this was a pretty smart decision. But what I really loved about this episode was the introduction of this other group of high schoolers, who are basically just a bunch of Japanese high school delinquents. They're total douchebags, and they're also pretty messed up. They kidnap all of the main three female leads from this week's episode and plan to take pictures of them and do God knows what else to them. But what I really was disappointed was at first was because they immediately run into them in a back alley, and there's Karma front and center getting ready to kick ass, and he does sort of intimidate them a little bit. I especially love when he grabs the one dude's face and puts him right into the ground, but then they start overpowering them, and that's when they realize, crap, we're going to have to reassess our situation and figure out how this is going to work. And luckily, Koro Sensei gave them these big guidebooks, which are freaking massive, and literally give them all the information they're going to need in order to survive this trip. If someone gets abducted, how they should handle that situation. It's extremely convenient and funny, but it's pretty obvious that this is not just a normal school trip. This was all actually to train them in the art of assassination as well, and that's apparently because in Japanese history, Kyoto itself is sort of like an assassination mecca. A lot of famous assassinations took there, and they're actually going to all the different sites, and this is going to help them out much later in the episode when they finally arrive and they run into all the bullies, and that's when they start fighting. But not until Koro Sensei arrives and starts literally knocking some sense into these guys. I especially love when they start to run towards them and he just bitch slaps all of them in slow motion, and then he just proceeds to really just destroy all of them, and the students are actually able to finish them off by literally throwing the books down on their faces. It's pretty awesome. But the thing that's really important about this episode, and this goes with the character of Kanzaki, is that the actual Japanese high school delinquents are kind of like a darker version of Class 3E. This is actually what they could become if they had no motivation, like Koro Sensei, in trying to make them into better students. And another thing about this episode is they're trying to bring up the concept of titles, which goes along with Kanzaki as well. She doesn't want a title, she just wants to do her own thing. And I believe it was Koro Sensei, he said, it doesn't matter if the water is muddy or not, the fish that swims forward is the finest. As long as she believes in herself and believes what she wants to do is right, that's really all that matters. And Kanzaki herself is just an adorable character. You just can't help but not like her. She's great. But what I really loved about this one was just Karma being awesome and creepy in the shadows, Nagisa being cool even though he got decked in the face. They all got their asses handed to them, but then they end up coming back and really start tearing it up, mostly because of Koro Sensei. But I thought it was really surprising that Koro Sensei decided to, like, show himself to some random people. He didn't really have much of a costume aside from a veil over his face, but for the most part, that's a big freaking octopus teacher in a gown, and they didn't really even seem to bother them that much. But it's definitely one of the cooler action scenes of the show, and it was really cool to see Koro Sensei kind of go all out, even though it's obvious he really wasn't even trying at all. So, what's the rundown? On this week's episode of Assassination Classroom, another fun episode that introduced another key character from Class 3E, as well as telling a pretty entertaining story with a nice message, which is to ditch the labels, be your own person. What I also really loved about this episode is that they managed to include this trip into their assassination lessons. I thought that was really clever. A lot of that stuff with the Japanese history that they're bringing up is going to go over some people's head. I know it did mine because, frankly, I just watch anime. I'm not like a Japanese expert or anything. I just like cool, kick-ass cartoons. I couldn't, like, write a paper or anything about Japanese history, but still, I really liked the fact that they explained that this was a city where a lot of important assassinations took place, and that's why they're going to all these famous sites and everything. This week's episode was mostly played for laughs, especially in the first half of the episode, but honestly, I'm okay with that because that's just the type of series this one is. I also like there was that one student who actually carved Koro Sensei a brand new nose, which supposedly looks more realistic. It really doesn't that much, especially with his whole overall getup. Just the fact that he has a perfectly circular head, he already doesn't look human already, but it's just one of those things you kind of just have to sweep under the rug and just sort of accept for what it is, and it's just funny, there it is. But the thing I love most about this episode is how well they were able to tell the story of a new student and do it all within the confines of, like, an action episode. And I thought that was really, really clever, because usually when they do that, it's usually just like, first half of the episode is devoted to them, second half is something completely different, and they managed to incorporate the entire story into this week's episode, which I think made it flow just a little bit better. Animation, artwork, music, voice acting is pretty much the same that you've seen from the rest of Assassination Classroom, which is to say it's very clean, it looks very nice. When there's action scenes, it looks really nice, and I especially love the lighting effects in this show, whether it's Karma hanging out in the shadows or the glowing red of Koro Sensei's eyes when he is really pissed off. So this was a really good episode, new student, really good lesson, some cool action scenes, and some brand new characters, so I really liked it. It wasn't a perfect episode. I think the first half was a little slow. I think we could have gotten to the trip a little bit quicker. Despite that, this was another high-quality episode of Assassination Classroom that you should definitely check out. So I'm going to give this week's episode a 4 out of 5. Check it out, guys. Really good stuff. Thank you guys for watching my review. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up. And before you guys leave, please tell me what you thought about this week's episode of Assassination Classroom in the comments section below. Remember, guys, if you have not subscribed to our channel, you can go ahead and do that by clicking on our channel icon right up here. You can also follow us on social media like Facebook and on Twitter. And I would also recommend checking out our brand new video podcast series, The Powerful Nerdcast. There will be a link for that in the description box below and at the very end of this video. Thank you guys for watching. Super Kami Guru 9000 out.